Okay, I guess we're starting. Well, thank you once again for welcoming me to the conference. This was, really great group of presentations, and I was very happy to see them. I'm going to go over a little bit of stuff that I went over in my previous talk a couple days ago, so just, a little bit of repetition, but then I get to some new stuff. So, since the election, I've been speaking to different civic groups and universities all over the world, because the problems I'm going to address today, rising political repression, the mainstreaming of white supremacy, the weaponization of social media by hostile governments, and an attack on the very notion of truth itself, are problems we see nearly everywhere, and not just in the United States. We're in the middle of a global rise in authoritarianism, but just as importantly, we're experiencing a global pushback against autocratic rule that has prompted many citizens to fight for rights that they had long taken for granted. People are recognizing their rights as they lose them. I saw that this year in the UK as shocked officials coped with hate crimes in the aftermath of Brexit, in the Netherlands as citizens worried they would get their own version of Trump and right-wing extremist Geert Wilders, in Estonia where the government is already on guard against Russian interference in their democracy, in Canada where my neighbor to the north is reassessing its role as the new paragon of stable democracy in North America, and in the US, where I've spoken to everyone from tech gurus in Palo Alto to civil rights activists in my hometown of St. Louis to international law experts in New York City and to others in many places beyond. I know that in Germany, these issues are also very much on your mind. We have a worldwide threat, but we also have a worldwide resistance. And that resistance is diverse and vast and not bound by any formal definition or formal allegiance. The resistance is at heart people helping each other. It's people trying to do right by each other and by the highest ideals of their countries. In Trump's America, however, this basic fight for constitutional principles and freedom has been deemed subversive. As an American journalist, I'm called an enemy of the people and a member of the opposition by my own government. The reason the resistance is seen as subversive and that I've been recast as an enemy of the state is because U.S. political culture has shifted so radically that autocracy and extremism have become the norm. In this context, the Constitution itself is a radical document. We now have an autocratic administration fighting against a flawed democratic society in a constant test of checks and balances, and it will take vigilance for freedom to be assured. To preserve our rights and the rights of others, we need to be ruthless in our critiques and match that in compassion for those who are targeted. Today I'm hoping to give you my analysis of what's happened in the US since November, where we're headed, and how to prepare for what's to come. To start out, I'll give you a little background on me and my work. As you know, I'm a journalist who covers US politics, most notably the 2016 election and its aftermath, but I'm also an anthropologist and a researcher. I have a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis, where I studied the political culture of former Soviet authoritarian states. I studied countries like Uzbekistan, a country ruled by an egomaniac dictator who abused executive privilege to enhance his personal wealth, who persecuted anyone who opposed him, who deemed the media his enemy, who had a strange and close relationship with Russia, and who had a fashion designer daughter who kept getting involved in state affairs, despite her total lack of qualifications. I studied countries like Tajikistan, where ministers are expected to greet the president with elaborate prepared statements of praise. I studied countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, whose dictators promote their self-image relentlessly, often naming buildings and monuments after themselves, while conducting kleptocratic shakedown schemes in which they steal national resources to boost their personal fortunes. You may see where this is going. The last 2 years have been all too familiar. And when my knowledge of autocratic states in Central Asia becomes relevant to understanding the US government, you know we have a serious problem. And I'm looking forward to the time when my research is not so highly in demand. On my talk on Wednesday, I gave some background into Trump's rise and how the media and political culture of the US has changed since June 2015, when he launched his campaign. For those who missed that talk, I'll summarize it briefly. Trump's rise to power was predicated in part on his ability to exploit pre-existing vulnerabilities in the US media, particularly financial problems that have been plaguing the industry for 15 years. The economy of the media has been decimated, and Trump, through his inflammatory and bigoted statements, provided a ratings boost, which led to an increase in revenue. By manipulating the media, who gave him nonstop and usually uncritical coverage, Trump was able to change US political culture and definitions of norms. He pulled the fringes to the center and made the mainstream extreme, and those extremists now occupy the White House. Trump and his key advisor, Steve Bannon, have blatantly said that their aim is the destruction of the United States from within, and they have since embarked on a kleptocratic shakedown, stripping the U.S. for parts. They have stocked the administration with officials who have been hired to destroy the apartments that they serve. The Education Secretary does not believe in public education. The head of the Environmental Protection Agency does not believe in protecting the environment. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development does not believe that the government should provide housing or urban development. And of course, our health care is likely being stripped away, leaving millions of US citizens uninsured and likely to die as a consequence. Trump and his backers are doing this in part for profit, but also because a weakened country is far more easy to manipulate and control. As I noted earlier this week, digital media was a key component of how they achieved their electoral aims and of how they rule today. Bannon used to be the head of Breitbart, an extreme right-wing and white supremacist website, and he was skilled at creating online propaganda aimed at manipulating Trump's base. He is also on the board of Cambridge Analytica, a technology corporation that has harvested thousands of bits of data on every American, culled through social media, and used them to issue targeted propaganda and false information. And of course, they were aided in this objective by the Kremlin, to which Trump has been connected for 30 years. The ties between Trump and Russia are long and complicated, and currently a subject of federal investigation, and I'm happy to answer questions about them later. For now, however, I want to return to the theme of the conference, which is the role of vitriolic digital media in politics, and in particular, how that affects public conception of truth and trust. Incidentally, the use of the internet by autocratic states is what I wrote my dissertation about when I was a student at Washington University. In 2006, I proposed a study of how exiles from Uzbekistan were using the internet to oppose their dictator and track whether their efforts would be successful. I was particularly interested in how the Uzbek government used digital media to retaliate against dissidents, and in what internal problems dissidents had to deal with, since issues like online anonymity and surveillance play out very differently in an authoritarian context, affecting already fragile forms of political organization. I was also interested in how political discourse could now easily transcend geographic borders, allowing both for new forms of resistance and mobilization and new forms of state control. At the time, I could barely get my advisors to sign on to this project because they viewed the internet as inconsequential to world politics and as a subject not worthy of anthropological inquiry. And I believe their view has changed now. Anyway, I got an early taste of what happened to the US last year by studying Uzbekistan's internet about a decade ago. Here is an excerpt from that dissertation when I was talking about how truth and power play out in the internet in an authoritarian context, and this is a quote. People involved in Uzbek politics are accustomed to rumor and lies. It's common practice to assume that all information is unreliable and all sources biased, which ensures that all rumors are taken seriously. Rumor is not automatically believed, of course, as much as it is shared, parsed, and discussed, sometimes far beyond what its dubious origins might merit. The result of ubiquitous paranoia is not disbelief, it's credulity. I wrote that about Uzbekistan in 2011, but it's a pretty accurate description of what's happened to US social media in the age of Trump and the era of so-called alternative facts, an era also marked by extreme partisanship, conspiracy theories, allegations of so-called fake news, and a lack of transparency in the government. While traditional media has propped up Trump to keep themselves afloat in a time of declining advertising revenue, social media has created information silos in which people tend to get information from friends rather than exploring media broadly, and has also become a purveyor of propaganda and lies from dubious sources. As I mentioned, this is now a subject of federal inquiry, as some propaganda transmitted through social media was among the tactics Russia allegedly used to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. So on a broad scale, we're dealing with a question of national security. But on a day-to-day level, as educators, as intellectuals, as citizens, we're all dealing with the basic question of how to tell fact from fiction. People are trying to figure out what's going on as they're aggressively bombarded with propaganda, bots, violently partisan rhetoric, and other tactics they used to associate more with regimes in states like Russia or Uzbekistan, but now associate with the US. And as in these foreign authoritarian states, people in the US have become both more paranoid and more gullible as a result. This has had serious social and political ramifications. A lot of folks think the, quote, fake news problem is a matter of getting a better education, and that those who've received higher education are more discerning. In my experience, that is not the case. I'm going to tell you a story of something that happened to me when I was covering the election last October. Back then, I was asked to serve on a panel held before the second presidential debate, the infamous town hall debate that occurred right after Trump's Access Hollywood video was released. I was one of several scholars to whom students could ask questions before the debate began. The atmosphere was very tense, so I was expecting some horrifying questions about what was going on in American political life. And in a way, the first question I got was horrifying, but not how I had anticipated. A young woman who said she was an undergraduate approached the stage and asked in total earnestness, "How do you tell fact from fiction? I read all this information and I honestly can't tell what's true and what's not. Everything seems to contradict each other, and even the prestigious outlets act like they're lying. I'm always hearing rumors and gossip, and I keep trying to sort it out because I want to understand this election, but I just can't do it. So I was wondering, can you explain to me how you figured out how to tell what a fact is?" And keep in mind, this was months before the term fake news had entered the vernacular and become a topic of debate. Here was an educated young woman at one of the top universities in the country who honestly couldn't figure out what a fact was or how to discern one. And the thing is, I couldn't really blame her. I was honestly grateful she was trying, instead of blindly accepting the information she was given. But it did take me by surprise until I thought about her age. She was around 19 or 20, meaning she could never remember a time before social media. There is no baseline standard to which she could compare present-day information and maybe feel on a gut level that something just wasn't right. I'm in my late 30s, which means I'm of the last generation to remember life without the internet. I was about 16 when I went online for the first time. This means I had to learn old-fashioned research skills, like reading books, looking things up in a library and not finding the answers, and debating information with others over time before deciding on its validity. The news industry worked in a similar way, and I know this because I worked in it during a key transition period. I was an employee of the New York Daily News from 2000 to 2003, a period in media history when print began to get overrun by the internet. I saw how when the budget cuts came, among the first people let go were the fact-checkers and the copy editors, and how the speed of news was ultimately viewed as more important than whether it was accurate. Because I lived through these changes and had to learn the way I obtained and accessed information over time, and because I worked directly in two industries that disperse information, media and academia, I'm better equipped than most to deal with the current information crisis, but I still struggle to find accurate sources of information and to process what I read. And if I'm struggling despite my multiple advantages in this arena, I think it's understandable that this young woman was struggling too. And judging by the email I get, A lot of people feel the same way. Anyway, this is a roundabout way of getting to my point that education in the digital era, especially educating a generation that knows nothing but social media, is a huge challenge. It would be a challenge regardless of our political climate, because it's truly a transformative moment in how we obtain and define knowledge. But it's especially challenging when you live in a democracy that is transitioning to an autocracy, and even more challenging when that autocracy has managed to rig a lot of the tools for obtaining information to reflect really vile objectives. I used to work in academia, and I still have a lot of friends who are professors in the US. And the stories that they've told me about what's happened to their students' ability to research and form opinions are horrifying. One friend of mine, a communications professor, started noticing around 2015 that her students were frequently citing Stormfront, a white supremacist website beloved by the KKK, and Breitbart, the right-wing extremist site that was run by Steve Bannon, in their research papers. They were repeating bigoted lies about African Americans, Jews, and other racial and religious groups, inserting texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into their paper without having any idea what they were. When she confronted them about this, she discovered that the very first results at Google often pointed to these websites. Her students were not intentional bigots, but lazy college students who used the first resource they found without validating its credibility. In other words, they were in the same position as the Washu student I described, unable to tell fact from fiction or from propaganda. But this is incredibly dangerous when it comes to the rote recitation of inflammatory propaganda meant to stoke hatred. Over the course of 2016, researchers learned how white supremacists, sometimes in league with Trump's team, had rigged search engines like Google to push these types of results to the top. It's unlikely that they'll stop these tactics soon, as they've proven effective. This means that educators are in a very tough position when dealing with digital media and teaching students how to research and think critically. The game is rigged so that bigotry and propaganda are often the first thing that students see, and they don't necessarily have the life experience to recognize it as such. And for those who grow up under Trump, it will become even harder to recognize this rhetoric as abnormal or these allegations as cruel lies. At the same time, the internet can be wonderful, allowing unparalleled access to a variety of resources and arguments and people. We've never had so much information at our fingertips, and it's never had such power to destroy our society. This is why, no matter who you are, but especially if you're an educator working with younger people, I strongly advise thinking long and hard about how you interpret and teach the news, whether works produced by the mainstream media, by fringe websites, or by seemingly objective sources you may find. Always ask why an article was written, who it benefits, who it affects, and what politics might have prompted its publication. Aggregation has replaced independent journalism in many respects, with outlets desperate for money quickly copying lies without fact-checking them themselves. So I advise looking more at primary sources and double-checking that quotes and articles are accurate. If it's a second-hand source, look for the original story to make sure the event depicted actually occurred. Often I found it did not. There's a hard line to walk here when you should not accept any information at face value, but also not become so cynical and paranoid that you give up searching for accuracy altogether. More than anything, that tends to be what authoritarian governments want. Look for consistency in reporting. It's often individual reporters who maintain professional and ethical standards better than whole outlets. In an era when the New York Times is soliciting dear leader type pieces of praise for the president from readers, even the former gold standards of media cannot fully be trusted. But most of all, I recommend learning and teaching the history of propaganda, which means teaching history in general. Teach how the media has operated in different cultural contexts and in different historic eras, and see if any of it looks familiar to your students. This can provide a basic framework to identify tactics of manipulation that are common in autocratic regimes. There's a reason that scholars of authoritarianism will refer to things as straight out of the Dictator's playbook, because there basically is a playbook. Tactics, of course, reflect the political and cultural contexts of their time, but people seeking to consolidate power for nefarious purposes often use the same methods over and over. These methods go hand in hand with general repression of citizens. This is a history that everyone needs to learn, whether you're a student or a teacher, in order to be better prepared to survive the Trump era. Trump ran a campaign built on lies, and within days of his inauguration, his administration openly advocated a philosophy of what they called alternative facts. They're open about their tactics in a way that suggests that they've consolidated power, but I don't think they have completely. Claiming that we live in an era of alternative facts, or that, as some put it, that we live in a post-truth world, is another propaganda tactic meant to demoralize you. Truth still matters. You know this because if truth did not have any importance, the administration would not work so hard to suppress it. And if you've been following the investigations into Trump and his cohorts' various misdeeds, you know this is a group of people who work overtime to suppress the truth, often trying to mask it with spectacle. So one of your tasks as an educator is to impress upon your students the inherent value of truth, that despite what officials say, it still matters. How you do this varies depending on what you teach, but remember, in an autocracy, even the hardest facts are challenged, often because challenging the truth so blatantly is itself a declaration of power. As I assume you've studied German history, you've no doubt heard the famous theory from Joseph Goebbels on the big lie, in which he said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can only be maintained for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. This is what I mean by the Autocrats' playbook. Dictators have used time-tested tactics like this again and again, and Trump and other leaders of authoritarian states are using them now. The difference, of course, is that digital media has transformed the nature of propaganda enormously. Since it's far more difficult for a dictator to completely control media, many have engaged instead in what scholars of the internet have called networked authoritarianism, where they leave the internet just free enough for propaganda to be effective, and bombard internet users with so much outrageous information that the search for truth seems futile. The big lie today finds its strength in numbers, in bots created by propaganda ministries, validated seemingly by retweets and trending topics, and repeated through aggregated content. The big lie is not only big in its audacity, but in its pervasiveness, as trolls and bots work to drown out opposing views and to harass those seeking to debunk it and search for truth. Citizens of authoritarian regimes know these tactics well, which is why they push back against the cynicism of governments who sneer at the very concept of truth. Back in April, I co-lectured with Masha Gessen, a Russian journalist who's written a great deal about propaganda and autocracies, especially in her native Russia. When an audience member asked her what websites they should read to get accurate information, she replied, Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Words are weapons, but autocrats are not the only ones who get to wield them. But without thinking critically about our words, without thinking about how veracity is conferred and confined in an authoritarian context, citizens will struggle greatly in this new online environment. I'll conclude by talking a bit about law, which of course relies on incredible precision of speech that has proven to be to Trump's detriment. As I've said before, Trump's administration has been an ongoing test of checks and balances, and while many have failed, the Republican-led Congress has capitulated to his whims, the media has abetted him far more than it critiques him, The judicial system has proven a struggle for Trump, as the online vitriol he relies on to boost his following and maintain power has become a legal hazard. Trump has responded to legal inquiries in typical autocratic fashion by firing those who investigate him, including Judges Preet Bharara, Sally Yates, and of course FBI head James Comey, all of whom were investigating his financial crimes and ties to the Kremlin. Over the course of this year-long investigation, Trump has relied on Twitter as his main way of communicating with the American public. He usually does this from his Real Donald Trump personal account, which I believe you know, instead of his official account as president, both because his personal brand is so important to him, but possibly because the questionable legal nature of what he tweets would be more dangerous should he do it on the official presidential Twitter. The question of why Trump prefers Twitter over other mediums is worthy of inquiry. Since July 27, 2016, the day Trump told Russia at a news conference that they would be rewarded for releasing Hillary Clinton's emails, Trump's primary mode of public communication has been Twitter. He held no news conferences between July 2016, which incidentally is the same month that his campaign fell under FBI investigation, and until just before his inauguration. Even after taking office, press conferences have been rare. Instead, Trump tweets, reducing everything from threats to foreign countries, to domestic conspiracy theories, to his ruminations on The Apprentice, to 140 characters or less. Twitter has proven an ideal medium for a narcissistic liar under federal investigation. Trump's tweets cannot be ignored, and therefore must be covered by the media. He's the president, and every tweet has the potential to tank stocks and inflame foreign powers. But it's difficult for journalists to challenge his tweets directly. Trump's Twitter is a press conference without a press. There are no follow-up questions, no spontaneous back and forth, no accountability on Trump's end. Instead, desperate reporters parse everything from the tweet's punctuation to his brand of cell phone before futilely seeking clarification from his various press secretaries, who often just refer them back to the enigmatic tweet, and that's if the press secretary will even show up. Power lies with Trump, who exploits the brevity of Twitter by using it to build murky yet self-serving narratives. But there are chinks in this online armor, and it's worth noting the way that Trump's use of online media may contribute to his undoing. The first sign of weakness was at the first hearing of James Comey, in which he testified on Russian interference. Panicked, Trump took to Twitter and live tweeted his own hearing, tweeting, "The NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process." This was a blatant lie. Nothing like that had been declared. After that tweet was read out loud, Comey and NSA head Michael Rogers debunked it by simply reminding the audience what they had just said. But I have to say, while watching that hearing in March, I felt for the first time a glimmer of hope that America still had something of a functional democracy. After months of being told that we live in the post-truth era, we were finally granted a serious fact-finding inquiry, one in which Trump's lies died upon arrival. Watching the Russian interference hearings was like watching opposing realities collide. The first, the cautious and methodical world of Comey and the representatives who questioned him, well, at least some of the representatives. The second, the bizarro world of alternative facts from which Trump beams in his fabrications. From the opening questions, focusing on Trump's tweeted fabrications about a wiretapped Trump Tower, to the debunking of his own tweet about the hearing, social media no longer became a tool of propaganda, but a means of self-indictment. Trump was forced to contend with damning official and public proceedings over which he had no control. There is nothing left for him to do but lie on Twitter, but then that old fallback too is stripped away. His tweets were reduced to evidence of his own mendacity, falsehoods disproved in proceedings the whole country could see. During the hearing, Comey noted the brazenness of Russian interference, stating that the Kremlin did not seem to care if the US knew of their actions. As I've said, that mindset mirrors the brazenness of Trump's team, who often lie without correction or consequence. Flagrant lies are how autocrats flaunt power. It's not merely the message of the lie that matters, but its shameless delivery, as it implies that both public reaction and truth itself are irrelevant to the regime's hold. But that grip loosened a little when Trump encountered a narrative he could not spin. At the hearing, the president had a new reality TV show, only this time around, reality itself was the star. Of course, this flicker of democratic integrity was quickly blown out when Trump fired Comey 2 months later. But it set the groundwork for Trump's ongoing self-incrimination on Twitter, which he has used to, among other things, intimidate witnesses and admit to obstruction of justice, which he also confessed to on television. The deeper and scarier question is whether there will be repercussions for these breaches of law, or whether Trump will simply rewrite the law so that he is above it, and whether those who attempt to hold him to a legal standard will be punished or persecuted themselves. That is the damning question at the heart of the debate on online vitriol in an era of rising authoritarianism. How can one speak truth to power when power is being defined as the only truth? That's a question that will be answered in the months and years to come. As of now, the U.S. hangs at the crossroads between a flawed democracy and a burgeoning autocracy. I hope my country chooses the right path. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Baron?
I actually want to just remark on your suggestion that we need more education about propaganda and all these things, which I think is a really great point, actually. Because I feel that, at least in Germany, I feel we had a lot of that. At least I, in middle school, felt that it was covered properly. And we also watched kind of these propaganda videos of Hitler and all. I mean, within this kind of thing, we really talk a lot about it. And I still remember a lot of these lessons, actually. Whenever I see other news or things that just seem, I kind of get skeptical because of this education that I had. Which is why I think it's actually a great way to start somewhere, at least, and kind of make particularly young people aware of being critical of this. To me, it really made a great difference. Even though sometimes you felt like, God, can we stop talking about it? Because I feel that we did a lot in school, at least in my case. But I really think that retrospectively, it did a great deal to my being very wary of these kind of things.
Right. No, I wonder about that with Germany in general, because, you know, you've had to confront that history. And like you said, you've had to watch the actual films. And in the U.S., I mean, people skirt over it because there was always this theory of American exceptionalism, that somehow we were immune from autocracies or authoritarianism. And of course, they would gloss over authoritarian, acts in our own history that existed, and in, like slavery, genocide, Native Americans, internment camps. I can go on. But I found that when I'm trying to convince Americans who are so used to thinking of us as an infallible democracy that it can happen here, one of the best ways is just showing other countries, just saying, okay, take a look at this. Like, does this resonate with you? Does this look familiar? Does this look like anyone who's well, sometimes in the White House, sometimes it is Florida Beach Resort. But that convinces the skeptics. I found that it is possible.
Fair enough.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your lecture. I've been talking about this with several other students from the GCSC within a specific research area that is about knowledge production, actually for a while now, but the era of Trump and also then the specific kind of relationship to at least the rhetoric of post-structuralism, because I have the feeling, and I just want to ask you what you think about it, because it's something we've been discussing for a while now, and we don't really know an answer to it. I studied literary studies and these kinds of related things, cultural studies related things, and at some point when it is time for us young students to get to the point of post-structuralism and the concept of truth, then we get to a general message that seems to say to us young left-wing apparently students that truth doesn't exist, that it's always a matter of power, that there's always, when you want to know what the truth is, you have to hear who is the voice that is speaking this truth directly to you, and that therefore everything is basically relative to some extent, and to a great extent whatever is the truth around you that also forms you and constructs you to a great extent more or less in your own hands. That was like 10 years ago. Now we are in a kind of different time. And what seems to be the case with the people who propagate the ideas of alternative facts, who whenever someone is speaking against Trump can respond to that by saying, yeah, but that's the left-wing media kind of empire. Mm-hmm. Of course they are speaking against Trump because that is, I mean, they are the left-wing empire, obviously. They want Trump to be silenced. It almost sounds as if they are using a quasi-post-structuralist rhetoric to shut up the very left-wing societal kind of voice that created that rhetoric in the first place.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think that that's true. I also don't think that's their inspiration. I'd be very surprised if Kelly and Conway were sitting around reading postmodern theorists for inspiration. But, you know, there's a difference to me in like that kind of theory where you're looking at the relationship of truth and power in order to get a more thorough view of a topic, to examine it from multiple sides, to not take for granted like this is true, not true. Like you're using intellectual inquiry, whereas, you know, Trump's whole spiel, you know, what you see in lots of autocratic states, it's just to sort of say it is irrelevant by nature, so don't even bother looking at it, you know, look the other direction. And you know, I was asked this at my other talk, like one thing I recommend is reading scholars from autocratic or semi-authoritarian states who have looked at these same postmodernist works. Like Masha Gessen is one who uses them. Peter Pomerantsev from Russia also does. And so they have a take where they found these same theoretical works useful, but they apply very differently, you know, when you're in a state that's not free, and when you're really grappling with fundamental like ideas of truth that are like, did he say that, yes or no? And you can prove that he did. You know, like Trump will say something and then literally just say, I didn't say that. Like the example I showed, you know, with the tweet. Or things like the size of his inauguration, where he desperately wants to convince us it was enormous, and we see the photos, and to them it doesn't matter that we can see them, and that's an act of power in of itself, to just say our little reality in front of our eyes doesn't matter. So it's two different things, but you know, I don't think you need to like throw out all of the graduate theory and stuff that you've had. It's just a different application for each context.
Alexandra.
Thanks for your talk. I have a related question about the term post-truth, basically, that is being used so frequently now. I work with it myself, and I find it difficult to wrap my head around what has changed. Because, of course, if we talk about a post-truth world, this implies that before we were living a kind of truth, which surely isn't true. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, what from your perspective, what has changed? And in part, perhaps you've touched on it, saying, you know, someone like Trump declares truth, but he doesn't really say that it doesn't matter what's true. He says, I am the truth. But still, it's not irrelevant. And I wonder, I do think something has changed, but I don't really know what.
Well, sometimes he almost does say it doesn't matter. I mean, sometimes he'll literally make a statement and then say, well, no, and who cares? And if someone asks him, is this true or not, it's just who cares? Or, you know, when he was giving his confession of obstruction of justice, he's like, I decided, and then he referred to himself in the third person, that Trump had no relationship with Russia. And therefore, we're not going to investigate this because Trump and Russia have nothing going on, you know. And I've wondered a little about the way he sees himself, and I thought it was interesting he went into third person. But that's sort of an act of post-truth in which he's literally defining a documentable past. We can see his financial transactions. We can see him interacting, you know, with Putin. We can see his speeches where he praises him. Like we can prove this. And, you know, I think obviously we were not in some sort of golden age before Trump came to power. You know, he exploited the vulnerabilities and the problems of the U.S. in order to get into office. Like here I mentioned the media in the talk I gave earlier this week. You know, I talked about economic vulnerabilities, political vulnerabilities. So yeah, we were never in like a truth era, but I think we've had a long decline in the idea of this. There's a famous quote from Karl Rove, George Bush's advisor from 2003, that was very similar to how Trump talks, where he was talking about the Iraq War and the fact that it was based on a lie. And he said, we create reality. You are merely our actors, and you will, read later the reality that we've created, and there's nothing you can do about it. Like that's a paraphrase of the quote. But that was an alarming moment, and I think that the Republican Party has kind of just gone with that idea of truth, of it being irrelevant, of it being theirs to claim, and of them using force and manipulative tactics, including, the integrity of our electoral system, to just get what they want, and they don't care that we know it. And Trump adds a new dimension because he's not a slick guy in certain ways. He just kind of he says the quiet part out loud, but so it's a little different than someone like Karl Rove, but it's still the same philosophy.
Which kind of brings us back to them all being post-structuralists.
If one of you guys writes an article about Trump and his advisors being post-structural, I think you should, just for an American audience to get into that.
I actually wanted to refer to those two questions, comments here, so yours and Herlov's. As a Polish national, I was also bombarded with the Second World War during my education, and seen as the political history in my country has recently developed, I can say that it had very little influence on the citizens. So I think there is perhaps another element, another component, or another aspect of creating a democratic society where people are responsible for what they say and how it impacts the community. And I've been thinking perhaps that's an economic aspect also, the fact that there are many people who are left out and who turn to the populist narratives because there is no alternative narrative that they would feel included in. That's one thing that I would like you to comment on with respect to the United States situation. And maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, I mean, economically, Trump knew what to say to people at his rallies, people who were hurting economically, to have it resonate with them. Like, I live in the Midwest. I live in that part of the country that they're always showing on TV with the rusted out factories and the, bombed out inner city and whatnot. And I remember one time I went to one of the Trump rallies and he said, unemployment is 40%. And, on the coast, the pundits were all laughing at this. Like, obviously, unemployment is not 40%, but underemployment is so high and lack of opportunity is so immense that I thought, oh, God, like, that's really going to resonate with people because people feel like everyone is lying when they say it's 5% because no one they know has a good job with benefits. And so that's the kind of lie that he does that feels true. But at the same time, I mean, I think that ideology, bigotry, misogyny, all of those are a bigger factor with Trump because it is not just his audience of primarily white men that are suffering economically. And the rates of, who voted for him, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, they're hurting economically more than white Americans. They did not vote for him. Black women are the most disadvantaged group economically. They voted for him less than anybody else. And so I think, there's an ability of some people to see through this or to, value, the threat that Trump brought to other people more than others. They listened and they thought, this is a guy who's xenophobic. This is a guy who's bigoted. This is a guy who's going to hurt our country and the people in it. And then his base of supporters, I did meet some who genuinely thought he was going to bring those factory jobs back. They were willing to overlook a lot of racist rhetoric in order to get that economic stability. I think he really... he spent a life conning people, and this wasn't really new. But I think the whole issue of the Trump voter, why they voted for him, this is not a monolithic group of people, and economic factors played one part. And I think his ability to exploit that pain in a very emotional way certainly played a part. But it was not, I think, the definitive factor, just kind of one of many.
And so the second part of my question that was relating to what Herlov was saying before. Is there a possibility of, perhaps not under this administration, but in the future, or how would you as a journalist see it, of creating a body, an institution that would actually control the internet and control the vitriol that is boosting Trump's power?
Like, would he create some sort of apparatus to control it, or?
Whether there would be a possibility of creating a body that would control this network of lies.
Right. I mean, he's already hooked up with a number of questionable people from Silicon Valley, including, Cambridge Analytica, which I mentioned, but also Silicon billionaires like Peter Thiel, who, bankrupted Gawker out of existence, the website. So he's known with that. And they tend to have this very libertarian kind of philosophy. Thiel is out buying islands in New Zealand so that when the apocalypse, which they want, hits America, he'll have a place to go as Trump and his band of cronies strip down the country for parts and, and take its wealth away. I could see them trying to envision, greater control of the internet. They've already talked about getting rid of net neutrality. I don't know whether this is feasible because our economy and everything runs on the internet. He's also faced some pushback from Silicon Valley folks. Like when I was in Palo Alto in January before he was elected, they were all trying to figure out what to do, how do we react to this? And the key problem I had with them is they kept insisting he would not be that bad, that he'd be presidential, that he wasn't going to really do these policies. And they were dealing with ethical issues like if he has a Muslim registry and he's using our software, what do we do about that? Do we, but at heart they didn't think it would happen. And of course it is happening. So I think it depends whether something like that can be constructed, depends on whether Trump is willing to use force. It depends on how much power corporations have and whether they're willing to use it to help Trump or whether they'll use it to help American people, because those are not the same aim.
So there is no possibility over the corporation or beyond corporations to actually create a body, a journalist, a board that would actually...
Like a propaganda minute. I mean, the thing is Trump doesn't need one. Like, he has
But against...
Oh, against it. No one has really suggested that. It's been annoying because I've said to them, if you want antagonistic, or not even antagonistic, basically objective journalism, journalism that confronts the problems there, put up some money because the media industry is hurting, and that's one of the reasons that they keep promoting Trump. They're also getting, as we know from the last few days, threatened by Trump. They're getting bribed by Trump. They have this very complicated relationship. They haven't shown much willingness to do that. I do think that there are journalists, who are in the midst of this environment trying to do a good job. There are people in the media who do it, but it's against very long odds, and it's a shame that people haven't thought to kind of just fund people more so that you don't have to, quit your job, which a lot of journalists have done over the last 15 years, because it's not an economically viable profession.
Maybe just a quick remark or one question. I would like to know if you would agree with the following quote, because you mentioned this quote about creating truth, creating lies, and it's often the case that the Republican Party has been framed around the idea of seeing the US as an empire. And in this way, in an empire, lies are a necessary mean to maintain the power, also to, in a euphemistic way, to control, not only to control, but to protect people. So if you would oppose this with what Harald Welzer said, who's focusing a lot on activism, that in this context, fake news is just the democratization of lies. So this would be my first quote for you, if, what you would like to add to this. And the second thing is, how do you, or do you see already a new development, because we were rightly so talking about fake news, but also more, I think more dangerously, the new notion that it doesn't even matter what is truth. And I would say that this is a rather new development which is kind of crystallizing, and is far more dangerous than just fake news. So this would be my second point.
Right. I'll start with that one. Does it matter what's true? I mean, that's the question that governments like this always want people to ask, because they want people to sort of shrug and just think we're dealing with a question of power. And even in the face of obvious provable truths, like video recordings, things like that, it doesn't matter. That's there. I mean, my view is always that it matters, and you just fight anyway, even if the odds are very long. The fake news is the democratization of lies quote is probably going to be bouncing around my head all night, so thanks for that. But I think, one of the things that drives me crazy with the fake news debate is that term is used to encompass a whole bunch of different phenomenon, like propaganda, lies, sloppy reporting, partisan rhetoric. I mean, anything can be labeled that. And of course, the term, once it came out, at first described the kind of bot army that propelled Trump, was immediately weaponized by Trump as a hashtag and slapped onto every article that, you know, the GOP and his backers didn't like. You know, the democratization of lies, like, that's a really euphemistic way to put it, you know, and I could easily see one of his more intellectual advisors, like Bannon or something, perhaps stealing that phrase, but I don't know. I mean, you know, it all depends on what you mean about democratization and the nature of power and the nature of morality, and that'd be a long response. The other question about, you know, Republicans seeing the U.S. as an empire and needing to lie to protect it. I mean, that was certainly true in George Bush's era. I wouldn't necessarily limit that conception to the Republican Party. I think you also saw it in the Democratic Party. What's interesting to me is that, you know, Trump ran as this isolationist, and everyone who knows him, like, at all, would know that that's just full of crap. That's just what people wanted to hear. You know, Americans were exhausted. It's been 15 years of war. You know, soldiers have gone on multiple, you know, incursions. And so, you know, people wanted out. He knew people wanted to hear that. Obviously, he was going to bomb things. He's obsessed with nuclear weapons. He bragged about bombing the shit out of ISIS. Like, those are the things that people should listen to. And I don't think, though, that he has sort of a typical imperialistic conception of world affairs, because I don't think you can find most countries on a map. But I think he's surrounded by advisors, some of whom have a very specific kind of imperialistic plan. And I also just think, you know, Trump, he gets offended easily. And if he's offended by Kim Jong-un, like, I really don't know what's going to happen. And so we're sort of in new terrain with Trump, lies, and weaponry. It's a really bad combination. And you know, and that has to do with the personal eccentric nature, I'll be euphemistic myself, of Trump as an individual human being.
Yeah, well, I thought about, like, it's not only about truth and if it's true or not, but it's also about selection. Selecting which truth is worth reporting about. And I have the feeling, I think I might be wrong, please correct me, that people focus on what Trump is actually saying or tweeting, but not what people are saying about Trump, like the other perspective. Why is that? Because he's actually being accused of rape, but to me it seems like no one cares. He's got elected.
Right. No, that's a great question. And, you know, I'll answer the rape part directly. I mean, Trump has been accused of rape multiple times. It was in his divorce hearings with his first wife, Ivana. He's been accused of sexual assault. He bragged about committing sexual assault. And you're right, except for that one brief week, I remember, because everyone was like, oh, we're going to have a national conversation. I was like, is this going to be like the one on race in which police brutality just continued afterwards? Because, you know, and it is. I mean, you know, sexual assault continues and he's the president. One of the reasons that people don't talk about it is he has one of the most aggressive legal teams I have ever seen. His lawyer, Michael Cohen, at the time, he's now also under investigation for Russian interference for being involved with that. He threatened to physically beat up journalists who reported on Trump's, you know, sexual assault allegations, including stuff in open documents like his divorce papers. He said he would ruin careers. They have threatened litigation to so many outlets. Like, I've written for places where I'll just mention, sort of like cataloging various bad things about Trump, that, you know, he just in the most neutral way possible, he was accused of rape by his ex-wife, or he bragged on tape about committing sexual assault. Almost every time, if it's an American publication, the editor will strike that out, which is why I write for Canadian and Dutch media, because I can talk about these things. And, you know, they are afraid of getting sued out of existence. And because the American media is so financially fragile, they don't want to take that risk. But I do think that conceptually, you know, pointing out who Trump is hurting is like the most effective thing we can do, because he wants, as a narcissist, everyone to just exist in this, you know, why is he so crazy? What thing did he do next? But meanwhile, you know, millions of people are suffering, whether they're people that had to interact with him personally or just the American citizenry who's losing their rights, losing their, you know, health care, their social safety net, you know, all the things that we need to survive. So I try to do that in my work, and I know other journalists do too, but there's too many, you know, puff pieces and too much kind of what does covfefe mean, you know, like that kind of thing, which I would rather they focus on the more serious allegations.
Let me just comment. So, no more free speech?
No more free speech? Oh, I think we'll have free speech. I mean, we're not there yet. We're, you know, we're a democracy that's transitioning, and we have a government that operates one way in a society that is extremely accustomed to having free speech. You know, like I mentioned my studies of Central Asia, like they have never had free speech, and we always had. And so I think it's not going to change overnight, where everybody just becomes silenced when, you know, we're used to being able to speak our minds, to mock our president, to criticize and write about him. So I think especially in the digital era, where even, you know, very authoritarian states still manage to squeak out some information, we as a, you know, not authoritarian state will certainly be able to, you know, to speak our minds. But do they want us to have free speech? I mean, no. You know, he wants unending praise. The people surrounding him want no one to investigate any kind of crimes or abuses of power they committed. Those are basically like the two big goals.
Yes, it's going to be a little personal, but on as a follow-up on what Stephanie just said, and on your mentioning that you're writing for Canadian and Dutch media, are you writing under alliances, or do you have to protect yourself? Do you?
Well, I mean, you know, I started out studying Uzbekistan, and like when you start out studying Uzbekistan and get banned from that country for exposing the fact that the president, you know, invented a group and massacred civilians and then blamed it on the invented group. That was like how my career began. You know, like I started there and I always had to deal with like their security services. And so now it's like, okay, it's my own country. And so I'm a little bit prepared in some sense to deal with it. But no, I mean, I write under my own name. If they're going to come and get me, which some of his, you know, various people under investigation have threatened to do, then you know, they'll figure it out. Like, I mean, right now, I mean, this sounds so cold, but, you know, I was talking about this with a friend of mine who is also a journalist and is also disliked by them, and we were kind of like, this is not the time that they would kill us. If they're going to kill us, it would be after we'd outworn our use, because right now they try to just make us look like crazy conspiracy theorists because we're women, and they can do this whole hysterical narrative. So, you know, your utility could be considered when you're figuring out, I mean, I'm sorry, I know this sounds insanely cold, but I've been thinking about this for 12 years with relation to Uzbekistan, because I've worked with so many dissidents, and so these are the conversations I would have with them about their lives, about the likelihood of the government coming to kill them, and so I sort of have a framework. But anyway, short version is no, I mean, I'm going to continue to write under my name and make everyone spell Kendzior, which is in Polish Kendzior, so, you know, Polish power.
Analytic? Yeah, I wanted to get back just to what you said. You mentioned twice, I guess, that people are mocking him, making fun of things he says and stuff. And I guess, yeah, that is happening. There was these ongoing jokes about his hair, about his small hands, about, there was even this picture circulating with him with a micro penis and stuff. And so on. And in Germany, that is sometimes even the thing that we perhaps perceive the most, like all this, oh, what did he do again? He's so funny and stuff. I mean, ridiculously funny. And I sometimes wonder that he's not reacting to that much, although he certainly hears about everything, which does perhaps not really go along with the very masculine image he gives. So I wonder if that is also a strategy, and if you see something behind this, like letting the people speak, let them do.
I mean, I think, you know, I'm all for the mockery. You know, like I think that if you look at any, I mean, first of all, because it's funny and I like that, but, you know, as a political tool, like that is an effective political tool when you're in a repressive society. You know, it's a way of kind of, you know, letting people make critiques indirectly, a way of asserting power. But, you know, Trump is bothered by the mockery. You know, you can wait after Saturday Night Live and he will have, you know, a shitstorm of tweets on Sunday morning, depending on what they did. You know, and he's someone who has written personal notes to magazine editors when they've commented on the smallness of his hands. And so he is sensitive to it. I think at this point, he's overwhelmed with the fact that this is not a campaign anymore. He's actually the president. He's in a lot of trouble in terms of, you know, potential federal indictment. So I think he has other stuff on his mind, but he does make the time to complain about the media is so mean. You know, that's his new shtick, and that's what Ivanka and, you know, the others say too, is like, oh, they're so terrible and cruel. This is as he's, you know, threatening people and talking about bleeding news anchors and stuff. So. But, you know, I think mockery, you know, I've seen it be effective in in Russia. There are a lot of Russian parody accounts of state officials that the government just hates because it just diminishes that power. It makes them seem less threatening, and it gives people kind of an outlet for emotional relief.
Yeah. So that they would not make real upheavals.
It could have that effect too. I mean, I think it just depends on who you are and what you're doing. One thing that was annoying to me is when he did that Kofefe tweet, and afterwards I saw all these American pundits saying, "Oh, Trump's just a human being like us. He doesn't know how to spell." And I was like, he's not. Like, he's, an autocratic person who's the president and whose Twitter could set off wars. So, like, maybe, one, don't forgive all his past sins because he can't spell a word, and also maybe don't applaud the fact that the president can't spell a word and, fell asleep tweeting on the toilet or whatever the hell happened. That's not what I seek in a leader.
Just to come back to the mention of Peter Thiel earlier, because you mentioned that he's buying islands in New Zealand. What's actually much more serious is that he's buying citizenship, right? And so there are things to be said about colonial countries and the mentality of, I guess, entitlement, which I think is part of what's going on with Trump and his people. But maybe just thinking about your other expertise in studying other countries as well, I'd be interested in whether you can comment on the extent to which what's happening internationally is something that's happened sort of spontaneously in various places because of whatever original cultural cause that could be multinational, or whether there's the prospect for what's happened with Trump's election to actually influence the politics of other countries and to have other consequences, I suppose.
Right. In terms of how Trump's election influenced other countries, I think we're seeing a real pattern where people have learned from the mistakes of the U.S. and also of Brexit. You had Brexit, and then you had Trump, and then everyone was watching very carefully the European elections, but you did not have a right-wing win in the Netherlands or in France, and you probably won't have one in Germany. And so, I think people look at Trump and then they see Trump-like characters elsewhere and they're like, we don't want that. And of course we have a different government, structure, which makes it less likely that a Trump-like figure could wreak havoc in a parliamentary system. In terms of broader trends of what's bringing about, authoritarianism, autocracy, I think a lot of it has to do with the crash of 2008 and the fact that, most places didn't recover. I think there's a lack of opportunity for people around the world. I think that, the super wealthy have become even wealthier to the point that they can do things like buy citizenship, buy islands, and that what happens to us, to regular people, does not affect them at all. Right now, Donald Trump's the president of the United States, and the stock market is soaring because to those people who have stocks, who are invested in, a certain level of financial prosperity, none of what happens to us matters. They're not worrying about their health insurance. They're not worrying about their rights. They can buy all of those things. And that, I think, is a very disturbing thing because you're seeing kind of linked oligarchs and plutocrats and people like that kind of forming their own alliances and then using them to influence government, to influence elections. That's really what's at the heart of the Russian interference scandal, is not really an ideological motive, but a kleptocratic motive, a financial motive. And that frightens me because it's very hard to battle people who have that much money and so few morals and so little care for the integrity of a democratic process, even if they were, a part of that process, even if they grew up in that country. They don't care. They just want to take. And it's, I don't know how to solve a problem like that.
I just want to briefly go back to the what we were just discussing right before with the previous question about the mockery of Trump, because it also links back to what we were talking about in the previous panel. And in the case with Trump, I was teaching in a program called International Studies right around the election, so with all my students we were constantly talking about Trump. Really, it was a topic that couldn't be avoided. And what mostly happened was that people were all laughing about all the crazy things that Trump had said this time, what he had said that time, and everyone, we are starting to forget this by now because he's been in power for a while, but there was for the longest time kind of a consensus that obviously he would not make it to president because he was just way too ridiculous. And it was very early already that I stopped laughing completely because I don't really think think it's so funny that he does stupid shit. I think that he does stupid things almost on a daily basis, and then I see all the social media, but also all the national media, also in countries like the Netherlands, that they have a half an hour of news at 8 o'clock, they have half an hour of national news at 10 o'clock, almost 3/4 of it was at some point kind of dedicated to the United States, also that I thought maybe some national news could also be nice at some point, first of all, why this focused on the United States, and second of all the news about the United States was mostly about what kind of crazy stuff Trump had done this time. And he said something weird on Twitter, isn't it hilarious? Really, meanwhile, he has become the president of the United States, and he said before that he's not just one man, there's a very strong and kind of just a very ridiculously aggressive legal kind of team around him that protects him kind of in almost every single way. So I'm not so sure in this case specifically if mockery is really at all a weapon. I have also the kind of the weird despairing feeling that it's really not a weapon at all. It's a last kind of scream for help that the opposition can do because there's really nothing else to do. He has a legal team around him that makes him just do whatever he wants to do, and everything that we can do in return is laugh at it. It's really not that.
Yeah, well, mockery as a central strategy is not going to bring Trump out of power. I mean, the greatest hope for that is exposing what he's done and trying to actually enforce the judicial system and in that process. In terms of mockery, like what drove me crazy during the campaign is that people were laughing about things that weren't funny. Like when Trump launches his campaign by saying that Mexicans are criminals and rapists, and people laugh because they say it's, quote, outrageous or something like that. Like that's not outrageous. That's horrifying. Like that's xenophobic and bigoted. When they laugh because, his hair blew at a funny angle, then I think that that's like another thing. And I think in that sense, it's letting off steam. And because Trump is so narcissistic and he is so insecure, that can actually kind of like put a chink in his armor if you're in a position of, you're back when he would give interviews. If you were interviewing him, that could be the kind of thing that could throw him off guard, make him blurt out something important and incriminate himself. So in that sense, I found mockery politically useful. At this point, he has insulated himself from the public. Like I was saying, he tends to basically communicate on Twitter. And in terms of the political purpose of mockery, I would not advise it as a central strategy of resistance, but if people want to engage in it, just because, they enjoy it, and I say, all the more power to you. Like I've known people in much more repressive countries that they find some solace in mocking their dictator. Sometimes they do it because, though, they don't have freedom of speech. And so these little jokes or these little parables are the way that you could communicate a critique. We don't have to do that in the U.S. We could just tweet that he sucks and nothing generally will happen to us, though not always. And so, yeah, I think that's at this point, it's less of something we have to think about because we do have that freedom, more or less.
Alexander?
I'm thinking about the distinction between truth and facts and lying, and you started to talk with how difficult it has become for some of us, especially for younger generation, to distinguish a fact. And we've talked a lot about Trump's lying, and in narrative theory there's currently a huge debate about fictionality, is very cursorily summarized, saying that I'm not saying the truth, which is very different from lying. And I wonder, do you perceive something like that with Trump? Is he not as rhetorically defined? Would you think that it's necessary to distinguish between facts and truth, or would you equate the two? Does he equate them?
I don't know whether, I don't think he's particularly reflective. I feel like he's someone who has a, he has an instinct for PR. Like I've never thought he was some sort of strategic political genius, but that is the one thing that he's sort of hardwired to do is, put an image out there, find people's vulnerabilities, prey on them, and lie flagrantly and naturally and easily. It's a hard question to answer with him in fact and truth, because then you also with him have to deal with the legal issue, and that's kind of at the heart of what this investigation is trying to figure out. Is it just like smoke, or is there fire, I guess would be like the distinction between lies and a untruth or a twisting of words. And so the way that we parse words and the definitions that they have this whole other meaning due to whether they indicate criminal wrongdoing. So, you know, it's tough. But I don't think personally Trump sits around contemplating it. I think he thinks he's doing a great job, you know.
Lara? Obviously I'm Trump, pretty passionate Trump hater, but there was this one single moment when I felt some kind of, let's call it sympathy for him, when he actually after the first couple of weeks said about his presidency that he thought it was easier, the job. And I was thinking about this because I had this feeling of okay, yeah, maybe he totally underestimated the whole thing, or maybe this was a strategic move of him trying to appear some kind of human, sort of show some kind of human side of his within all this. And I was wondering if, first of all, you thought this was kind of a strategic move maybe, or was it just the little Trump child speaking out without thinking much
I can tell you it's a strategic move because when I was in Estonia about a month ago, and I was on a panel with true Trump advisor / supporters, and then another conservative who was anti-Trump, and then me, like the lone person with progressive politics. So it was an interesting panel. But anyway, that was the mantra of these Trump guys. One was the vice president of Ford Motor Company. Another one is, I think, the president of the Heritage Foundation. And they kept saying, he's inexperienced. He didn't understand the job. You have to feel, they actually said, we want you to feel sympathy for him. We want you to feel sorry for him. And there's this famous meme of me now on the internet where I'm looking at him at the moment he says this, like with my eyebrow like up in the air. I don't know if I could do it again because I was like, what? You know, that's the president. Like, you know, as a child in the U.S., you learn that's like one of the hardest jobs, and he definitely had many months to learn that this would be a difficult task, and he'd have to lead the country. And so, yeah, I think that was something, maybe he did really say it, and then they're like, oh, that's good, you know, go with that, say that one. I feel like that's sometimes with Trump more how it works than the advisors just telling him to say something. I mean, you can tell when they informed him to say something, like when he had to apologize for the Access Hollywood video, and it looked like he was held for ransom or something. He obviously didn't want to apologize, but I think in this case he might genuinely feel that way, which is probably why he goes golfing all the time. But, you know, they know that makes him, it's better to have an incompetent president than a criminal one. They want to make everyone not think of him as a criminal. And if the whole line, and you also see billionaires like Mark Cuban putting this out, like, oh, he's too dumb to have done any of that. That's his defense. And I think Trump's really cool with that defense, as long as he doesn't go to jail. He's fine having everyone assume that he's, you know, not particularly bright, because then he's like the common man. He says, I love the uneducated. So he's just in that big, wonderful group of, you know, not particularly intelligent people, and he's cool with it. So yeah.
And to follow up on that, do you think there is a chance he might actually quit the job himself at some point?
I cannot. It's just so not in his nature. I mean, he I guess that's the one thing. Now I'm sort of doing a reverse of the debate where he said that about Glenn, is, you know, he doesn't quit. He comes back. He's like a cockroach, like just over and over again, no matter what happens. And I think he also would see that as losing. And the one thing that he cannot stand to be seen as is a loser. So I think if he goes from the White House, it's going to be in handcuffs. It's going to be ugly. It's probably going to provoke a time, if this happens, of great political instability and probably civil unrest, possibly civil uprising among his fans, depending on how, you know, the evidence is presented. So I can't picture him just resigning, even if it's to save himself, to cut a deal, you know, the art of the deal. That's not the kind of deal that he makes. Maybe I'll be wrong, though. Who knows?
So, I know there are other questions, but I was wondering, is there a question from someone who hasn't had an opportunity, has a question but hasn't spoken yet during after?
So obviously most of us aren't Americans, and equally obviously we're interested, and I think it's fair to say invested in the outcome. There's this expression, I'm not sure if it's Canadian or global, but that when America sneezes, Canada catches a cold or catches pneumonia, so we are dependent on these outcomes. With that in mind, what can dissidents or citizens more generally outside of the US do to contribute to, I think, the outcome we'd all like to see, in terms of, you know, not necessarily, I mean, if Trump gets out, then you have Pence and then Ryan down the line, but what can we do to sort of make things better for all of us?
Right. Well, if the U.S. sneezes, I mean, y'all are on like, you know, like a lifeline. I don't even know. Yeah, I mean, it affects the whole world. The world is endangered by having this man as the president. I mean, one thing that's helpful is that, you know, our news media is compromised in certain respects. There still is some, you know, good reporting, but because of the threat of litigation, it's often very difficult to publish. So, you know, writing in foreign media, which of course everyone can access because it's on the internet, is something helpful to expose those crimes. I think also, you know, keeping in mind, as you would for any country that has a, you know, unlikable government, that, you know, people are different than the government. The majority did not elect him by any means. It was, you know, 25% of the population. And of that, I think quite a few have buyer's remorse. So, you know, it's hard because I do think the one thing that can bring him down is this incredibly complicated investigation either into Russian interference or into his business dealings and his lack of divestment and his abuse of executive power. Like, those are all very complicated legal processes. And so it's just a matter of, you know, like, what do you value in your own society? What are you afraid you're going to lose? Like, keep it, work to keep it, because America did not work to keep it. You know, I think people tried to prevent this from happening. I also think there's, you know, was a concerted effort to bring him in that wasn't legal. But in many ways, you know, we failed as a society over, you know, a long time. Like, we let people suffer. We let people get angry because they were suffering in plain sight and no one was doing anything to help them. Our institutions began to erode. Trust began to erode. Those are things that can happen anywhere. Those are the baseline things that can produce this kind of government. And since I assume, you know, y'all don't want one, you know, watch out in your own countries too.
So I have heard of. Are you holding up okay, Sarah?
I'm okay.
Ready?
Sure.
Carol.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think this is my final question. Otherwise, just keep going. But I still think there's it's weird that we keep talking about Trump himself as a person all the time. I think that it's a very clear sign of a cult of personality, which is usually historically also directly related to a form of totalitarian kind of regime. And even if we are mocking it, or you're just interested in his emotional kind of intentions behind certain things that he might have been saying or might not have been saying, we first of all lose it. He's not a one-man kind of government. There's a whole bunch of people around him, and it is happening. It is happening everywhere. It's definitely happening in the Netherlands. I've been very, very scared in the last few months that we would get Geert Wilders in charge, actually, who is doing not just a little bit the same, but he's doing exactly the same as Trump. Even his slogan was "Make the Netherlands Great Again." And guess what? Everybody was laughing about it. That is just ridiculous. But it's not ridiculous because it's working really well.
And like Trump, he was the second party to win. His was the second party to, in terms of numbers of votes.
Right.
And he's not a very new phenomenon in the Netherlands at all. He's been in politics at least for 25 years. He was part of the biggest conservative right-wing party that has been in charge for way too long. The VVD has been now in power for how long? I don't even know. I don't know how they do it.
And now you also have Thierry Baudet as well, who also,
yes,
I don't know which one's worse. Yeah.
No, but and then you always get this kind of this double play between Geert Wilders and our actual prime minister for the last few years, Mark Rutte. And they used to be colleagues. They used to work for the same party. Mark Rutte is kind of an invisible person. He was kind of the norm. Geert Wilders was the outrageous clown, who was actually much more dangerous than everybody thought for years and years. And Geert Wilders could say something really weird, and then the prime minister could say, Geert Wilders, that is really weird. And then everyone would be like, ha ha ha, indeed, that is really weird, Geert Wilders. And meanwhile, he was rising to power. This is just the basic kind of beginnings of cult personality. It starts because we think he's a funny clown. Then at some point he becomes a mysterious man and we wonder what his intentions are. Meanwhile, we forget that it's not a one-person thing. There's a whole bunch of people working on it at the same time. So why?
And the society.
And then there's society as such, and the way it is actually constructed. So
Yeah.
isn't it kind of time to finally let go of our complete obsession with the person? Can we just start thinking about the system that supports it?
Oh yeah, no, I absolutely think that. And like when I write about him, I go one by one, you know, through all of these people who, like Trump, I've divided into haters and losers. The losers being the incompetent people hired to destroy their departments. But then this team of ideologues, people like Steve Bannon, the campaign team, people like Manafort, Roger Stone, who's a central figure in American politics. Like a team needed this, you know, it took a village, ironically, to bring, you know, Trump to power. And so you need to look at that. And in terms of, you know, the Netherlands, like I feel like, you know, you've got it right. You guys are in the time that we were like 2 years ago, where you have the threatening but sort of some people find amusing figure lingering in the background. And you do not want that guy to actually make it in to have a sphere of influence, because the results are horrifying. And hopefully the Netherlands, like other countries, has seen this really happen to the US, these dramatic changes, and rejects them. But yeah, I think it's more important to look at those background figures. And you can tell when they want you to not look at someone by the way they're presented in the media. The fact that Jared Kushner never speaks, but there's little puff piece profiles of him coming out, making him sound charming, and Ivanka's prince. And, you get that this, it really looks like, propaganda. It reminds me of what I see on the children of all, dictators around the world. And so they also, you can tell that they don't want that, because they get very, very concerned when reporters start poking around at those background guys. So, if Wilders has those guys, like, look there, because that's often who pulls the strings.
Maren, and then Anne-Marie, I think.
Oh no, I was
Okay.
just
Okay, Anne-Marie then, and then.
Yeah, it's related to what we're talking about. Also to what Knarf said, so we have countries in Europe where similar situations came up, but finally some of them already are over, and the people we were afraid of finally did not make it to reign, like Geert Wilders, but also Marine Le Pen. And now we have to see what is happening. Are they growing slowly and perhaps winning the next time? And I'm wondering, but this is a very speculative question, I don't know if you can answer it, but if there would have been a chance for Donald Trump to grow slowly within the next 4 years, if he had not won yet this time.
I mean, he's been growing slowly for a long time. That's one of the myths that Trump put out himself. He portrayed himself as a political outsider, as a neophyte. This taps into the thing he's doing now. We're like, I didn't know it was hard to be president. Like, he first thought of running for president in 1988. That was the first time he flirted with a run. Then again in 2000 as a liberal Democrat. Then in 2012 was when he got serious, and that's when he was building up the birther myth, which brought in, this band of freaks, people who were thought to be on the fringes of society, like Alex Jones, or Breitbart, very right-wing people, very racist people, who he has now brought into the mainstream. But people didn't notice, or they noticed and didn't take it seriously. They thought of it as sort of a sideshow. But that's how he grew. I mean, I feel like he played the long game, and he also had people managing his PR as a reality show host. I mean, that, in terms of the question about cult of personality, that's something that's very distinct about Trump, is that he's an American brand name. I mean, if you look at it technically, the brand is associated with failure. It's, casinos that went out of business. It's, houses that were condemned. It's a steak that you can't eat. It's a, flimsy tie. I mean, it's all a bunch of crap, with Trump, made in China, and, make America great again sold on it. But he managed to kind of, to triumph anyway. And he's this, I can't remember life without him. Like, I'm in my late 30s, and Donald Trump has always existed and has always been hanging in the background of the media. And so, he's unique in that sort of slow build. But I would watch that with, whoever the corollary is in your own country, and see how they're building up that base. And don't dismiss that base as peripheral, because that base can eventually become the center.
I actually had one question about Trump's Twitter. There was talk for a while about Twitter, the company, following, speaking Clinton's words, the idea to delete his account. What do you make of that? What are the chances for that? What would be the interest in that?
I wish that they would address this. And I've actually tried, like, I vaguely know Jack of Twitter to get him to talk about this, and he won't talk about it with me. I think at this point, that this is how the president has chosen to communicate with the world, which is kind of a mind-blowing thing, that he's doing it through a private company, and it carries enormous weight. And, if a war begins through Twitter, that will be on the shoulders of that company. So I don't know what they're going to do. I think that this is something they potentially could have done during the campaign. I think the fact that everyone kind of just shrugged and said, okay, yeah, he communicates through Twitter, that itself was a bad sign. People should have been pressing more then. I think that, there's a change in the way that articles were written, in which reporters don't interview people anymore. They find their tweets and they drop them in the article. And so Trump lent himself very well to this new kind of political phenomenon. But I don't know what the legal and ethical repercussions are going to be. I mean, I already feel like he's made Twitter a necessary toxic space, which is a terrible thing. Like, I sometimes would really like to quit Twitter. I can't because I work in journalism. But even if I didn't work in journalism, I'd be forced to read all those tweets because those are my president's official statements. Like, they get recorded by the White House, like when he writes about, Mika Brzezinski or whatever. So yeah, I feel like they have some kind of obligation, but they don't seem interested in tamping down on hate speech in general. After Trump won, there were neo-Nazis that they had banned from the platform. They allowed them back and they verified them with check marks, sort of giving a approval. And I feel like that's the direction Twitter's going because they know that makes them money. And that, unfortunately, is the bottom line.
Well, I also have a question because I, like a lot of people, think like everyone, I thought about the reasons why Trump was elected. And you said a bit about what kind of groups sort of didn't vote for him. And I think mostly middle class people or lower middle class, also especially I think women, white women voted for him. And I think we see sort of a similar trend here in Germany where we have the AfD, so the right-wing party, gaining votes by people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. And those are mostly the people who have some sort of capital. They have, some sort of income and stability in their lives. And for some reason, they get this idea that, for example, helping refugees or taking in refugees will somehow affect their lives to an extent that they will lose what they have. They will lose their stability, their money, and so on. And which is obviously not true. But I wonder, how can you educate people who are adults, who have all this life experience, but how can you educate them?
Right.
Especially in a post-truth world.
It's a hard thing because, you're right, like, it is older people that voted for Trump, older white people, both men and women. And that was also true with Brexit. It was the oldest generation that voted for Brexit. And so younger people, who, of course, there were some young people who voted for Trump or Brexit, but on the whole, not so much, are having their futures defined by this basically a baby boomer generation who, like you said, doesn't want to pay for refugees. In the American case, they think, people don't deserve health care, that it's a privilege instead of a right. I don't know how they come to these conclusions because they grew up with all of the benefits you could possibly have, structurally from the system, only to take them away from their progeny. And it is hard to educate them. Like, when I would interview older Trump voters, a lot of it was, among the racist ones, it was like fear of this future full of, immigrants and, and refugees and whatnot. These were usually in places where there were no immigrants and refugees. It was just based on a fantasy version of what they saw on TV and in media. And in terms of sort of the fake news, post-truth environment, that's where mainstream media really comes into play, because I think that older generation was much more influenced by stuff like Fox News in the United States, a very conservative news outlet, than by reading Facebook or Twitter. Especially in the rural areas, there are areas where they don't even really have broadband internet and people aren't on social media that much. That's not reported that much because no one really goes to those areas. But I live in one of those states with a big block that's uncovered. And yeah, it's hard. I mean, what I worry about is more, what are the norms of behavior, of dignity, of morality that younger people are going to learn under this administration? Like, these things that were once condemned as outrageous or wrong or cruel are now becoming normal. And, we saw throughout this conference all these examples of extremely hateful rhetoric that people try to dismiss as irony, or they justify as, ultimate freedom of speech. And I wonder, what it will be like when this generation grows up and they're older. what kind of world will they expect and think is, good? What will they strive for? Like, will they condemn these sorts of practices that hurt people? Or will they just think it's no big deal because they've been surrounded by it their whole life, and then they see it reflected in people like Trump, or Boris Johnson or Le Pen or whoever, that rise to the levels of, the highest powers in government. It's a scary situation, and add to that lack of opportunity and debt and all the other problems young people have. And yeah, I'm not super optimistic. But.
Last question, Stephanie?
Yeah, I want to briefly talk about The Simpsons, because they're famous for criticizing and mocking, for example, bad situations or whatever, people. And you cannot sue Homer Simpson for saying something against Trump, for example. So how important, or what's the importance of pop culture or a TV series that is fictional, for example? What's their role? Because I think they're kind of in a special position. It's not an independent journalist that you can just fire, for example. So how do you think is this important that we have those series?
Yeah, I mean, Hollywood has been anti-Trump, and it's anti-Trump both in that, weirdly enough, over the last year, I've personally met a lot of celebrities who are putting their money and their time into opposing him, into trying to shut down certain initiatives. But they also have you can judge each, TV show, each movie individually, but generally the America that's produced by Hollywood is more diverse, is more tolerant, is more varied than the extremely narrow vision of America that's put forth by Trump. And so I think people have taken a lot of comfort in pop culture, and that still goes on. That engine keeps chugging. Like you said, it can't be censored and controlled like the media. We don't notice a radical difference in our shows. A lot of shows, I think, were rewritten and restructured to kind of address the themes of the administration and, our political frustration. And then you had kind of inadvertent things happening, like The Handmaid's Tale coming to Hulu at exactly, the right moment. But I think kind of like mockery, it's important, it's an outlet, it's a way of, people building communities and conversations around it, but it won't be what takes them down, but it's still, something to reconcile with. And for The Simpsons, that hasn't been that big in the US, for, 15 years. So what's interesting about them is they had a whole episode where Trump was president, long before this year, which I think can be used as a sort of yes, he was flirting with this run. He's not this, neophyte who just magically stumbled in 2015. This was an ongoing joke. Lots of pop culture trumps. Biff from Back to the Future Part 2. Whenever you have a greedy, terrible villain with bad hair, it's often inspired by Donald Trump. So on that note.
I think we've squeezed you enough, and I want to ask everybody to give a warm
Thank you.